He was my father figure. He was the family's hero. He taught me to tie a tie. He signed my college loan application. He stood at the head of every holiday table for 2 decades. But the moment I found his hidden ledger, that man vanished. I realized the horrifying truth. The person I loved most was a predator, and his prey was his own family. It didn't happen in a lawyer's office or during a raid. It happened during spring cleaning. A dusty box labeled innocently old tax records, shoved deep into a storage closet in the family office, the office he was supposed to share, but never really did. When I lifted the box, I heard a dull clunk. Felt heavy, wrong. Inside, beneath a decade of useless corporate invoices, was a worn leather-bound book. Locked. The lock wasn't ornamental. It was heavy brass. That moment I knew. Call it instinct, call it dread. I knew this book held a secret too ugly for the light. I didn't get a key. I used a screwdriver from the junk drawer. I didn't want permission. The first page was not a diary. It was a balance sheet. At the top, in my uncle's unmistakable, precise handwriting, was the title, Project Phoenix Target Acquisition and Disposal Schedule. Our family business was the target acquisition. Our collective retirement funds were the disposal schedule. I saw dates stretching back 15 years almost to the day. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a war waged against us in slow motion. But the most terrifying thing on that page was the last entry. It was dated last week. The plan wasn't history, it was actively ticking. To understand the scale of the horror, you have to understand the man. My uncle wasn't just a successful businessman. He was the unquestioned patriarch. After my grandfather passed, he was the only one with the financial expertise to handle the complexities of our inherited assets. He was the safe harbor. He carried the weight and we gave him the keys. He had total absolute authority. When my brother needed tuition money, Uncle wrote the check. When my mother's roof needed repair, he handled the trust disbursement. Every question about money was met with a soothing lecture about fiduciary duty and how he was protecting us from ourselves. We didn't ask for receipts. We didn't ask for audits. Why would we? He was family. He was the uncle. And that is why I have to ask you right now. Have you ever had a relationship where you gave someone 100% of your trust, no questions asked? Tell me about that relationship below. How did you decide they were worthy of that blind faith? The betrayal isn't just about the money lost. It's about those 15 years of smiles, advice, and shared holidays that were all poisoned by a secret agenda. This video is my investigation. It is my accounting. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the entire 15-year plan. How he used shell companies and fraudulent loans to dismantle our legacy, the subtle psychological warfare he waged to keep us dependent, and the terrifying ongoing legal battle we are facing right now to reclaim what little is left. We begin now with the quiet beginning, when the seeds of his downfall plan were first planted. To understand what we lost, you have to understand what we had 15 years ago. This wasn't just a handful of savings. This was a legacy. Our family had built a significant commercial property portfolio and a thriving generational business. It was stable, solid, and poised for growth. The money wasn't the point. The stability was. It represented decades of hard work, meant to secure my generation, my children, and beyond. Then came the crisis that created the opportunity for my uncle. My grandfather, the true financial patriarch, passed away, and my own parents were deeply grieving and completely untrained in managing an estate of that size. The market was volatile, and we were suddenly facing complex inheritance laws. We were vulnerable, and my uncle, with his tailored suits, his MBA from a prestigious university, and his practiced air of quiet confidence, stepped forward. His pitch was simple, logical, and impossible to argue with. I'm already in finance. I'll consolidate everything, manage the transition, and protect the core assets while you all grieve. He was geographically convenient, he spoke the language of law and money, and he was family. We didn't interview other candidates. We didn't hire an outside firm. We simply said, "Yes, thank you." And with that, we handed him the entire unsecured future of our family on a silver platter. That was the moment Project Phoenix officially began. For the first few years, he didn't steal. He built his prison walls. His focus was on making himself irreplaceable. He immediately moved to simplify the legal structure, dissolving old, transparent partnerships and replacing them with convoluted holding companies and trusts in states where reporting was minimal. He began communicating solely in dense, complex financial jargon, citing sections of the tax code and obscure regulations that none of us had the expertise, or frankly the energy, to challenge. Whenever someone asked a simple question, he'd respond with a 2-hour lecture that left them feeling ignorant and ashamed, ensuring they wouldn't ask again. He discouraged financial literacy among the rest of the family. If a cousin suggested taking an investment course, he'd subtly undermine them with a comment like, "That's lovely, but true management requires expertise. Leave the heavy lifting to me." He cultivated a narrative that we were all too emotional, too busy, or too unskilled to manage the money. He made us dependent on his brilliance. That dependence was the primary tool in his downfall plan. He needed us to be intellectually paralyzed by fear and awe. We went from being owners to being petitioners, asking him for money that was, by all rights, ours. Think about that power dynamic. When someone you love gives you bad advice that costs you years or millions, how do you even begin to quantify that loss? The emotional damage is one thing, but the actual tangible financial hit, the lost opportunities? If you had to put a monetary value on the damage of bad advice from a trusted relative, what would that number be? I want to know your thoughts. Looking back now, the clues were everywhere. They weren't screams. They were tiny, persistent whispers we were desperate to ignore because confronting them meant tearing the family apart. The first major red flag was the sudden termination of our longtime family accountant, George. George had worked with my grandparents for decades. My uncle claimed George was outdated and too slow. George tried to call my mother. He left a cryptic message saying he was worried about a new fee structure. My uncle intercepted the message, spun a flawless narrative that George was bitter and old, and we immediately dismissed it. We chose to believe our uncle. We chose the easy, comfortable lie. The second flag was the unpredictable anger. Any question about a specific transaction, not even a challenge, just a simple query, would unleash a torrent of fury. He would get intensely defensive, not about the transaction itself but about the implication of distrust. "After everything I've done for you," he'd thunder, "you question my integrity?" We would apologize and retreat, embarrassed that we'd hurt the man who was sacrificing so much for us. He weaponized our family loyalty. We were repeatedly presented with opportunities to see the truth, but every time we instinctively turned away. And this is the universal tragic flaw that so many of you likely understand. What is the biggest red flag you've ever ignored because you loved the person who was waving it? That blind love and that unwillingness to break the peace. That is what enabled him for 15 years. It was the greatest gift we ever gave the predator. Now we move into the cold mechanics of betrayal. The first 5 years were not about outright stealing. They were about setting up the perfect siphoning system. This is where the complexity he demanded actually served his criminal purpose. The strategy was simple. Make the family assets pay for their own destruction. He established several shell corporations, dummy companies with impressive professional names, in jurisdictions that offered maximum secrecy. Then, he introduced the concept of the management fee. He claimed that to properly protect and grow our legacy, these outside entities were required for specialized consulting, auditing, and restructuring. These fees were astronomical, often 10% to 15% of the total income, every single quarter. On paper, the money went from the family trust to Consolidated Services LLC. In reality, that LLC was just a mailbox and a bank account controlled exclusively by my uncle. He wasn't stealing money. He was billing the family for his own theft. Furthermore, he began selling valuable pieces of our inherited land or minor holdings, not to the open market, but to his own shell companies at a fraction of their true value. He would then turn around and sell those assets publicly, keeping the enormous profit for himself. He was the only one who saw the full balance sheet, so the slow, consistent drain of cash went completely unnoticed. He didn't take the inheritance in one shocking move. He bled it dry. This method of draining a business through padded invoices and phantom charges is shockingly common. It's what makes fraud so difficult to spot when you trust the person issuing the bill. I want to know, does this strategy of using phantom charges sound familiar? Have you ever heard of a family business being systematically drained by management fees? After 5 years, the slow siphon wasn't enough. My uncle grew greedy, and the plan shifted from careful theft to high-stakes gambling with our future. This is where he used the family's good credit and valuable unencumbered assets, our main family home, the core commercial properties, as collateral. He secured massive, high-interest loans from legitimate banks. The family was unaware of these loans because he used his sole signatory power and intercepted all correspondence. He then immediately diverted the millions of dollars from these loans into extremely risky, speculative investments that he controlled personally. If the investment paid off, he kept the profit, cleared the small loan interest, and we never knew the risk. But if the investment failed, the debt, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, fell directly back onto the family trust, secured by our property. He wasn't using his money to gamble. He was using our generational stability. This created a perfect scenario for him. Heads, he won big. Tails, the family lost everything. Over those middle 5 years, he shifted our strong debt-free legacy into a house of cards leveraged to the hilt, all to fund his private thirst for fast money. The constant pressure of managing this immense debt is likely what drove him to the final, most desperate phase. The final 5 years were about the cover-up and the final drain. As the risky investments failed and the debt mounted, he couldn't hide the missing capital anymore. This is when he moved into outright document fabrication. We found evidence of forged signatures on deeds, backdated property sales to confuse the tax authorities, and fictionalized business failures that he blamed on the market to justify the losses. He didn't just steal the money, he destroyed the paper trail. He purposely created an immense, complex pile of contradictory accounting records, designed not to fool an investigator, but to overwhelm and bankrupt us before we could even start the legal fight. He knew that if the family ever saw the truth, they'd have to hire forensic accountants, lawyers, and civil litigators, and he made sure the cost of that truth would be astronomical. This complexity means that even with the ledger, the path to justice is long. It requires precision. If you were a forensic accountant, not a family member but an objective professional, and you had to break through his 15 years of lies, what would you ask for? If you were auditing this family, what's the one single document you would demand to see first to immediately uncover the fraud? Let me know your pick in the comments. We've talked about the how, the shell companies, the leveraged debt, the forged signatures. But the money, ultimately, is just the mechanism. The real poison, the true horror of Project Phoenix, lies in the why. Why would a man who had everything, respect, influence, and the financial means to live comfortably, spend 15 years planning to destroy his own flesh and blood? This wasn't desperation. This was a deliberate act of sustained, cold malice. When we finally looked beyond the spreadsheets, the deeper motive started to emerge. It was a cocktail of chronic jealousy and deep-seated family resentment. He wasn't stealing to survive. He was stealing to punish. Perhaps he was the sibling who felt consistently overlooked by our grandparents, the one who didn't receive the same emotional recognition or praise, even if he did get the education. He may have felt that the family's success, the inheritance, was not the fruit of shared labor, but a debt owed to him for years of perceived slights. We found journals, not the main ledger, but private writings where he referenced old arguments, old disappointments, things that happened 30 years ago, using words like restitution and justice. To him, we weren't family. We were creditors who needed to be silenced, or beneficiaries who simply didn't deserve what they had. This realization is far more terrifying than simple greed. Greed is manageable. Resentment is a cancer that grows, patient and quiet. It means that every kind word, every piece of advice he gave us for 15 years, was laced with this silent hatred. We have to ask ourselves, which motive do you think is more destructive? Pure greed, which can be quantified, or deep-seated family resentment, which festers and seeks total ruin? And this motive explains the most perverse part of the entire operation, the mask of benevolence. My uncle wasn't a shadow lurking on the fringes. He was right at the center of our lives. He would frequently appear as the hero, the savior. He would fund my cousin's unexpected medical bills, give generously to family charities, and buy spectacular gifts at Christmas. He'd pay for family vacations or cover the full cost of a grand reunion dinner. He did this because he needed the mask to be flawless. These acts of generosity were not kindness. They were investments in our blind trust and tools to deflect suspicion. How could you accuse the man who just paid for your daughter's tuition of destroying your life savings? Every time he played the hero, he was not only maintaining his cover but also deepening our emotional dependency, guaranteeing that when the collapse finally came, we would be emotionally devastated and financially crippled simultaneously. He was using our love as insurance against prosecution. The cost of those acts of kindness was insignificant compared to the millions he was simultaneously draining into his hidden accounts. We cannot let the emotion overshadow the fact that this was not a moment of weakness or desperation. This was cold, clinical planning. And the ledger proves it. We found early internal communications, not with banks but his own written notes, from the very beginning of the 15-year period that discussed setting up accounts under alias names and exploring different jurisdictions for secrecy. He wasn't just reacting to the opportunity to manage the family money. He was positioning himself for the exploit. This is the crucial distinction. We found notes predating the transfer of assets where he had already detailed plans to maximize personal liquidity and insulate assets from family access. He didn't stumble into fraud. He walked into it deliberately, with a briefcase full of resentments and a 15-year timeline. The motive, that old corrosive family jealousy, was simply the fuel that kept the engine running, ensuring that when the family finally realized the truth, there would be nothing left to save. It was the ultimate prolonged act of revenge. Finding the ledger was only the beginning of the war. The real battle was fought in the living room. When I presented the evidence, the detailed accounting of Project Phoenix, I expected shock, but I got a denial. The family fractured instantly. There were those of us who had seen the subtle red flags, those who were financially savvy enough to understand the fraud, and those who saw Uncle's manipulation for what it was. We formed Team Truth. But then there was Team Uncle. This was the hardest heartbreak. They were the ones who depended on him the most, the ones he protected with his superficial generosity, or the ones who simply could not comprehend that the pillar of their world was a criminal. He raised us, they would cry. He signed our mortgage. You're breaking up the family over a bookkeeping error. The irony was crushing. We weren't breaking up the family. His 15 years of lies were. The schism became immediate and absolute. We were accused of paranoia, jealousy, and attempting to seize control. The defense wasn't legal, it was emotional. We chose love over evidence. We had to accept that we weren't just fighting a thief. We were fighting a family cult of trust that he had painstakingly cultivated for over a decade. The evidence had to be overwhelming. And even then some refused to see. This is the moment where logic fails and emotion reigns. Even when faced with undeniable truth, some people cling to the familiar lie. So I have to ask, if you were watching this unfold and the uncle was still denying the ledger, what single piece of proof, one transaction, one document, would finally convince you to abandon your loyalty and join Team Truth? We knew we couldn't proceed legally without one final attempt to face him. The confrontation took place in a neutral setting. A lawyer's conference room, cold and utterly unforgiving. We laid the ledger, the forged documents, and the damning early communications across the table. We didn't accuse him. We simply showed him the evidence and asked him to explain Project Phoenix. His reaction was the most terrifying moment of the entire ordeal. He didn't erupt in anger, nor did he beg for forgiveness. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculated smile spreading across his face. He called us naive. He pointed out the loopholes we missed, the legal protections he had erected, and the sheer cost of fighting him. His words were chilling. It was necessary. You were never going to appreciate the legacy until I took it all away. And now you can't afford to get it back. It wasn't remorse. It was a cold, quiet admission of intellectual victory. In his mind, he hadn't committed fraud. He had executed a masterful, justified takeover. That absence of conscience, that clinical pride in his own deception, was the final fatal blow to our hope. The confrontation gave us no emotional closure, only the grim mandate to proceed. The scale of the financial ruin was breathtaking. We didn't just lose potential growth. We lost homes. Retirement funds were completely gone, liquidated to cover the debts from his high-risk schemes. The family business, once a source of pride, was leveraged to the point of bankruptcy. The legal fight began immediately. filing emergency injunctions to freeze his remaining assets, preparing a massive civil suit, and filing criminal reports. But the fight is brutal. We are spending the little money we have left to chase money that is often offshore, locked in complex trusts, or simply spent. We are fighting a man who spent 15 years building the perfect labyrinth. Every day in court means more legal bills, forcing us to liquidate the few remaining assets just to afford the fight for justice. The financial loss is calculable, but the personal cost is infinite. Every time a new bank statement arrives, my heart rate spikes. Every time the phone rings, I assume it's bad news. That constant state of hypervigilance, that fear of being exploited again, has become our new normal. The most devastating loss is the shattered ability to trust. How do you look at any new relationship, a business partner, a friend, even another family member, and not question their ultimate motive? The uncle didn't just steal our money, he stole our innocence. He showed us that the greatest betrayal comes from the source of the deepest love. It fundamentally changes who you are. This is a question I wrestle with every day, and I want to hear your answer. What is harder to lose, the money that can be replaced, or the ability to trust the people closest to you? So where does this leave us today? The 15-year plan of destruction is finally exposed, but the legal fight is nowhere near over. We are in the trenches of a massive multi-jurisdictional civil suit, fighting to claw back every penny that my uncle tried to hide. There is no quick resolution. There is no single satisfying moment of victory. The family that chose Team Truth has grown closer, forged in the heat of this unbelievable adversity. We're rebuilding, not the grand legacy he stole, but a new, smaller, stronger foundation based on transparency, skepticism, and mutual accountability. We've learned to do our own books, to ask the hard questions, and to assume nothing. The money is mostly gone, but we are surviving. And in the face of what he tried to do, survival is a victory in itself. This story is not about giving up. It is about enduring. We went through hell so that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to. If there are 3 painful lessons that every person watching this should take to heart when mixing family and finances, these are them. Lesson number 1. Never delegate financial control without mandatory, third-party oversight. Trust is a beautiful human emotion, but it is not an internal control. Get audits. Get second opinions. If a family member insists on being the sole signatory or making the documents intentionally complex, that should be your loudest alarm bell. Lesson number 2. Legal paperwork must trump familial affection. If you are doing business, whether it's managing a trust or running a joint account, the boundaries need to be written, signed, and enforced, even if it feels cold. Your relative is a manager first and a relative second when it comes to money. Lesson number 3. Look for patterns, not isolated incidents. Betrayal is a strategy, not a single mistake. Don't rationalize one delay or one outburst. If you see a consistent pattern of secrecy, deflection, and complexity over time, you are looking at a plan. These lessons are simple to say, but agonizingly difficult to implement when love is involved. I want to know your reality. Which of these 3 lessons do you think is the hardest for families to implement? Trusting documentation over affection, or simply demanding oversight, and why? My uncle succeeded in stealing our assets, but he failed to steal our future. He stole our security, but he failed to steal our resilience. The only way to truly defeat a predator is to survive the attack and share the story, turning the darkness into a warning light for others. He gave us 15 years of lies, and we are now going to give the world 15 years of truth. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If this story resonated with you, if you have faced familial betrayal, please subscribe to this channel for updates on the ongoing case. And most importantly, share your own stories of familial financial betrayal below. Let's stop hiding this kind of trauma in silence. Let's talk about the recovery process together.